we're looking at are these differences between Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. They have, fundamental philosophic disagreements about the very nature of the United States government, how the Constitution ought to be interpreted. One of them believing that the Constitution should be viewed very, very strictly, that it was concrete, that it was exact, that it only meant certain things, and that it should essentially be taken word for word. What do we call that kind of interpretation of the Constitution? Yes? That's strict construction. Which one of these two was the strict constructionist? Jefferson. The other arguing that the Constitution has far more flexibility to it, and that it is, while it is meant to be taken seriously, it's not necessarily word for word, and there's no way the framers could have foreseen every little thing that would happen, and so there's flexibility here to allow Congress or other parts of the government to respond, as long as they stay within certain parameters. What is that interpretation of the Constitution called? That is loose construction, and which of the two was the loose constructionist? Very much Hamilton. So eventually this starts to evolve into, we kind of see this split going. Now, again, Washington's administration is what you would call nonpartisan, meaning, or at least most historians look at it as nonpartisan, meaning that political parties didn't exist. It didn't really have a party affiliation. When you look at, a list of presidents or something, they make posters and charts and different things. They say when they were president, all this stuff. Oftentimes, they will say what political party they were. Usually, Washington will not have one listed, and he's the only one. Because, again, political parties did not quite exist. They start to form in his presidency. You can't really say, when political parties act. There's not like a specific date where that happens because it was rather gradual. But certainly by the time he has left office, there are two distinctive groups, because Hamilton's side starts to kind of go in one direction, Jefferson's side kind of going in the other. We got talking about Jefferson's side yesterday, calling themselves Republicans, believing themselves to be the true believers in a republic, the true believers in Republican values of power to the people, power to the citizens, power to the masses, the individual landholder, the small farmer, making out a humble existence who is independent and doesn't need anybody, he stands on his own 2 feet, good citizen, all that sort of stuff. More, power to those people, less power to a central government, not wanting that. Their adversaries, the other side, they're going to start calling themselves, or be called, Federalists. Now, just as these Republicans are not the same as modern-day Republicans, do not think that they are, because it is a completely different thing. These Federalists are not necessarily the same as the Federalists that we talked about just a few weeks ago. It does contain some of the same people, but not all of the same people. But they are called that for a similar reason. So Federalists, this of course is Hamilton's side, the Hamiltonian Federalist, and others that thought that way. I mentioned that Washington is the only president that usually does not have a political party attached to his name, but sometimes you will see him labeled as a Federalist, because if you had to pick one, he's a Federalist. He just probably would not have liked you saying that, but he does lean that way, because he tends to side with Hamilton almost all the time. Anyway, so these Federalists, what do you think they believe about the power and the strength of the national or federal government? Yeah, they think it needs to be strong. They want more centralized government, stronger centralized government. Not necessarily all-powerful centralized government, but they definitely want there to be more structure. They see Jefferson's way as, how things were under the Articles of Confederation, and that caused numerous problems, as we saw. And people like Hamilton and people like Washington would have certainly felt that, probably more than someone like Jefferson did, because what were Washington and Hamilton both doing during a lot of those Confederation years? Yeah, they're fighting a war. And as you read about and when you listen to some of the music assignments, they struggled with a lot of problems not having supplies, because Congress didn't have the authority there wasn't a centralized authority to, get it together. So it's quite likely that they, saw the benefits of having stronger authority, and not all-encompassing authority, but having a stronger central government. Thus the name Federalist. That's why they are called Federalists, because they supported a stronger federal government and believed that was going to be better for everyone. The Federalists, as far as their version of the Constitution, they of course are going to be more loose constructionist. They're going to, believe in that and rely on that to, give the government more flexibility to respond to certain situations. Now, with the Federalists and Republicans, I kind of mentioned this to Republicans a little bit. What kind of people, socioeconomic wise and so forth, do you think are going to be more likely to support the Republican Party? Yeah. It's going to be the farmers. This is going to be the small farmers. This is going to be the middle to lower classes that are typically going to be supportive of the Republican Party. Therefore, what parts of the country do you think are going to be more supportive? What are going to be kind of the Republican strongholds? It's going to be the South. It's going to be the West, which at this time, remember, the West is like, western parts of states like Western Virginia or something. So it's going to be in those more rural areas where they're going to draw their support. Federalists, what kind of people do you think are going to support the Federalist Party? Yes. It's going to be more merchants, bankers. It's going to be people with larger land holdings. It's going to be people with businesses. It's similar to the Federalists that we talked about, in the whole Constitution ratification debate. That same kind of thing. That's where they're going to get most of their support. So Federalists are going to have much more of a stronghold in the North, particularly in the Northeast, because that is where the businesses and the banks and all that stuff was. Now, therefore, they're going to be supported and get most of their support from wealthier classes, from kind of that more elite, wealthy, more powerful kind of class. So you can see there's kind of a bit of a class struggle that's going on here as well. Which brings us to the issue of this sort of elitism thing that the Federalists get tied to, which I don't think is completely untrue. They're certainly not innocent in this. But the Federalists, Hamilton in particular, get accused of believing that, maybe accused is too strong of a word, but anyway, that the wealthy people needed to rule over the small farmers. That they need to be, that the common folk, the folk that Jefferson tends to support, that those people need to be kept in line and need to, not have a direct say in the government. They needed to have, richer people sort of rule over them. That is true, technically. So the Federalists often get accused of being rather elitist, and in a way they were. But from their point of view, that one thing that was not an uncommon way of thinking. People like Hamilton and other Federalists simply do not trust the masses. They don't trust the people that Jefferson loved so much. They do believe that those people are not really fit to govern, and those people are not really able to make rational decisions. They would look at something like Shays' Rebellion. Okay, remember what kind of people were rebelling in Shays' Rebellion? It was the poor farmers, right? They would say, see, that's what happens when you let people like that have power. When you don't have a strong central authority, this mass rabble of people who don't know any better, who are irrational and cannot make good decisions, that's what you're going to get. You're going to get violence, you're going to get anarchy, you're going to get turmoil and chaos. So that's why we need a stronger central government to protect the masses, to protect those people from themselves, because they cannot handle that kind of power. They're often vilified for that, and perhaps they should be, but that was the common thinking at the time. But, Jefferson would look at that as, he did have far more trust in those kinds of people. So it's also a difference between them over not just the size and the scope and the power of the federal government, but who ought to be in charge. And for the Federalists, they would say it is the wealthier people. Now, why wealthier people? Is it just about money to them? Yes?
They usually have more education.
Yeah, in these days, those would have been the people with education. Those would have been the people that would have been viewed, for whatever reason, as being more rational, having a better head on their shoulders, and more capable of making certain decisions. Were they right about that? We know no, but that's the thinking of the time for sure. So these two, now like I said, it's not always the same people. People like Hamilton, for example, he was a Federalist when it came to supporting the Constitution, and obviously he's a Federalist here. So there are some people that fall into the Federalist category both times. But that's not true of all of them. Madison, for example, he was a Federalist when it came to the Constitution, but he's a Republican when it comes to all of this, and doesn't agree with Hamilton and all of it during this go-around. So those political parties start to form, again, becoming a bigger and bigger and wider split as we go through Washington's 2 terms of office. Going back to the financial plan, remember, I kind of mentioned this yesterday, that the financial plan does go through all parts of it. The national bank is created, assumption goes through, tariffs goes through, excise taxes go through. And a lot of the effect of the financial plan was pretty good. A lot of it did exactly what Hamilton expected it to do. It did bring money in. They did start getting debts paid off. It did restore the nation's credit, actually incredibly rapidly. So it's really quite a miraculous thing how it is able to turn the economy around and kind of set the economic path of the United States in an entirely new direction in just a small amount of time. However, of course, not everybody is going to be pleased with it. There's always people that will not agree with something, and it is true that this financial plan, that some of these policies hurt some people or affected some people differently than others. That's true of any economic policy, not just this one, but there's always going to be someone that's not made better off by any kind of particular policy. Well, that causes some problems in some places, certainly some mumbling and grumbling in some places, but it also leads to potential violence in some issues. We're going to see later in the Washington administration an incident called the Whiskey Rebellion. Remember that one of the parts of the financial plan had to do something with whiskey. What was that? Right, there's an excise tax placed on whiskey, and as I was mentioning yesterday, whiskey makers, you're not talking about big corporate distilleries and stuff, not big major corporations, who were the makers of whiskey for the most part. It's Western rural farmers, people that grow wheat and grow corn, and because they're so far out in the wilderness, they can't ship that stuff to get it anywhere in time for it to be sold before it goes bad, so they make their money off of distilling it into whiskey. So who that tax really affected was these small farmers. Well, that causes some of these small farmers, particularly in western Pennsylvania. This Whiskey Rebellion happens in western parts of Pennsylvania, which we tend to not think of Pennsylvania as being the West, but remember we're talking about those more rural areas. Some of these farmers are very, very angry about this whiskey tax. They feel that this is unfair, all those things, and so they start rebelling against it. They start refusing to comply with it. They say, we're not going to pay. They start attacking the tax collectors, the government officials that were out there to collect the tax. They were supposed to, one of the ways they, assessed this was, you had these tax collectors and officials that would go out and, register. The farmers had to register their stills, the contractions they used to actually distill the whiskey, and they would pay tax based on how much you produce. A lot of the farmers were refusing to do that, some of them going as far as just burning down and destroying them rather than have to pay the tax. So they are attacking tax collectors, are burning stuff down, refusing to comply, and saying they're not going to do it. Now, so far, this probably sounds a lot like a previous situation. What does this sort of remind you of? Maybe that, maybe more recent though. Shays Rebellion. This should sound a lot like Shays Rebellion. You have poor farmers mad about taxes, saying they're not going to do it. Now, so this is a real test for Washington, because we know how that one is. So this is kind of the first real test of all this stuff, and the first real test for the Washington administration. And he's rather perhaps conflicted over exactly what he should do about it. What do you think if Washington were to call a cabinet meeting and ask his 2 most trusted advisors, Hamilton and Jefferson, what do you think Jefferson would tell him to do in this situation? Get rid of the tax. Why would Jefferson probably tell him that?
Because that's what's making the big money.
Yeah, Jefferson would probably say, you need to go in there and appeal this tax. I told you this is what was going to happen. You tax the poor people. You're getting what you deserve. This is not fair. He probably would have wanted to him at least to talk about it, and would have argued that, they're simply responding naturally to something that is unfair, that this, disproportionately affects them, and it's too high, and you're taxing people that can't afford it. That's not right. However, what do you think Hamilton would probably tell him to do? Certainly keep the tax. What would we do about all these farmers that are rebelling? Yeah. Send in something. Yeah, he'd probably say, you need to go in there and tell people who the boss is. You need to go in there and tell those people they got to obey the law. That this is your chance to say, you cannot like something, but there's going to be law and order. You have to obey the law. That we're not going to have lawlessness. We're not going to have people just losing their mind every time they don't like something. And ultimately, we have this. That's what it's about. It's enforcing the law, enforcing this tax. And this is your chance to show that and to demonstrate that strength. What do you think Washington's going to do? He's going to follow Hamilton's advice. That's right. So Washington's response is he is going to personally, only time the sitting president has personally led a military engagement, personally leads troops into Pennsylvania to put down this rebellion. Now, that sounds a lot more dramatic than it really was. Did they raise troops? Yes, and there was all this business, but they didn't even have to actually do anything. They did not have to actually engage in any military action, because when these farmers hear that Washington is close by with forces, what are they going to do? They stop, so they desist. So they don't have to actually go in and start shooting anybody or even get close enough to actually see them. The rebellion falls apart and they withdraw as soon as they know that Washington's on his way. But I'm certain he would have done it had that been the case. So here we said this was a situation that started out rather similar to Shays' Rebellion. We had upset farmers mad about taxation, rebelling against it. But in Shays' Rebellion, how did the national government react? They really couldn't do anything. But this time, how did the national government react? They responded. They put it down and they enforced the law. So that brings us to the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion, what it demonstrates. Understanding that what it demonstrates meant different things to different people. But we can definitely say, what do you think the national government kind of proved in this case? Yeah, that they can enforce the law. Proving this kind of demonstrated strength of the national government. Whereas Shays' Rebellion, revealed how dangerously weak the national government was. The Whiskey Rebellion demonstrates that this is not the same situation. This is a much stronger national government under a new constitution. This is a government that can and that will enforce its will. Now, again, that was interpreted differently by different people. People on the Hamiltonian side might have said, good job. We've shown people that, that there's a democratic process, that they don't like something. That's why we have elections. That's why people vote. Put different leaders in charge if you're not happy with something. But don't go grab your torches and your pitchforks and go nuts. That's not the way things are going to be done. People like Jefferson, however, probably saw this as a very troubling sign. Saw this as very foreboding. They might say, so this is what it is now. You don't like something, you complain, and so the government comes after you with the military. They see this as very threatening and as very dangerous. Nevertheless, it does set that kind of important precedent. And again, this is why, people like Hamilton that say you can't trust the masses, you can't trust those common people, they're irrational, they're violent, they act on their passions and they don't think things through. They would see something like the Whiskey Rebellion as proof of that, to say these are why these people can't govern. This is why they can't be in power, because this is what they do. This is why you've got to have stronger people kind of ruling for them. Okay, so that finishes that section. We are going on to section 2 here, so don't put away yet. Questions on that much? All right, so we're going to go ahead and start section 2. Let me get that up and ready here.